What's up, gang? I'm here because I wrote a document summarizing my metaethical position, and I have two debates on my channel regarding my metaethical position. So I just wanted to kind of spell it out. It was very fun. It was a very fun experience to write philosophically, let's say. I'm not used to it, so it might not be the best. I've written this document, so hopefully I can gather some critiques, and my audience is pretty intelligent. At least that's. I see some very insightful comments sometimes. So I'm hoping that some people can comment some critique and can help me flesh out my position better. We're going to be arguing for a moral realist position of a naturalist kind. So that means that we believe that there are some moral facts and these are mind independent. And in particular, because we're naturalists, we think that the moral facts are natural facts. They are facts concerning the physical structure of the universe. Oh yeah, and in particular, the moral facts are going to be utilitarian. So the moral truth is going to basically be spelled out by the most common consequentialist position, I would guess, that is utilitarianism. So in any case, we're going to make it short and sweet. So we're not going to go through all of these 22 pages, but I'm just going to get right to it. We as humans are biological organisms. And as biological organisms, we are subject to some constraints. For instance, we can't see objects in 4 dimensions. Moreover, I think that there are some epistemic and inferential principles we necessarily value. So, for example, we necessarily value the law of non-contradiction. We don't want to hold contradictory beliefs, and we experience cognitive dissonance if we do so. We necessarily value what our eyes see as a piece of evidence, as something that counts towards a certain fact being true. These epistemic and inferential principles that we necessarily value, that seem to be instilled in us in some way, that we all hold, and when we go about our life, we all abide by, are something that I think exists. Where do these principles we necessarily value come from? This is boring, so we're going to skip this. Just going to consider the fact that they're instantiated in our biology in some way. They're part of our source code. Yeah, so for now, that's enough. Let's make this short. Okay, so let's say we agree, and there are these principles we necessarily value. So where do they come from? Well, they come from some aspects of our cognitive architecture. Some physical aspects of our cognitive architecture. I believe that even in the domain of morality, there are some moral principles that we necessarily value. We're going to say that a logical or moral statement is true if it correctly describes what we necessarily value regarding logic/morality. Now, it seems like because there are some things we necessarily value in the epistemic and logical domain, that there could be things we necessarily value in the moral domain. So, how do these domains of cognition work? Now we're trying to explore how domains of cognition work to understand how we can reach necessary values, or what we're going to be calling first principles in these domains of cognition. So many domains of our cognition appear to function with slow and fast processes. Domains of our cognition that vary between the visuospatial, the linguistic, mathematical, physical, inferential, logical abilities all seem to be captured by a model where we have slow processes and fast processes. These fast processes give us some quick heuristics, some very efficient intuitions regarding what is true or what to do in these domains, while the slow processes can be used to actually reason out and try to perfectly understand a certain scenario. So just to give an example, so assume that we see a person flipping a coin 100 times and it always comes out heads, then we're going to instinctively, through a fast process, create an intuition that that coin is very likely rigged, because the probabilities of the coin coming out 100 times heads is very low. Now, if we wanted to use a slow process to analyze this scenario, we could calculate perfectly all the probabilities involved in this scenario and actually see what is the likelihood of such a scenario happening. Now, we don't really need to do this in this case, but if you want to trade on financial markets, it wouldn't be good to rely on fast, intuitive pattern recognition abilities given by fast processes to trade on these markets, but in that case it would be good to do all the calculations. Now, why is this the case? Because our heuristics, our fast processes, have been created and modeled after our evolutionary environment. So when we get some quick intuition, that is an intuition that is very efficient and works well in environments that are close to the ones that we spent most of our evolutionary history in. A more scientific account of this fast process, slow process dichotomy is given by dual process theory. So dual process theory posits that there are two distinct cognitive processes that operate in our minds: a fast and intuitive automatic process and a slower, more deliberate and rational process. We don't really need, for the sake of the argument that we're building here, dual process theory. I mean, any theory that manages to accommodate the fact that it seems like we generate intuitions through a fast unconscious process and through a slow conscious one will do the job. But we're just citing dual process theory here because it lends credence to what we're saying regarding these cognitive domains. Now, usually, at least in some domains, the fast heuristics that are not always consistent that we generate, they are sometimes called biases. What we're gonna assume is that these fast heuristics have an objective in mind. So there is an objective that these fast heuristics are after, and these objectives are going to be spelled out by the first principles, by what we necessarily value. So there are things we necessarily value, and then there are these heuristics, these biases, that are efficient ways to reach what we necessarily value, but they don't work in all situations, or they're not perfect in all cases. This is why sometimes we call them biases. So, just reading now, we typically violate rules of logic and probability and resort to simple and near optimal heuristic decision rules to optimize the likelihood of an acceptable outcome. This may be effective in conditions with time constraints, lack or overload of relevant information, or when no optimal solution is evident. These are biases. Now, because many other domains of our cognition function with these fast and slow processes, we may take a small leap and assume that even the domain of moral cognition functions in a similar manner. So what does that mean? It means that we're going to have a set of heuristics, intuitive biases. Our moral intuition are going to represent both some intuitive heuristics, and they're going to be tied to some necessary first principles, some things we necessarily value. Okay, so immediately a thorny question arises. Now, since the biases, the heuristics we generate, are ingrained in our cognition, so they're produced, they're biologically ingrained in us. how do we differentiate the biases from the necessary values? How do we see what the heuristics are trying to follow? What is the objective of the heuristics we generate? So I think an answer to this question can be provided by our slow processes. So our slow processes can reason on the intuition given by our fast processes and then compare them and test them. For example, if one notices that he generates two contradictory intuitions, and this sometimes happens, especially in the moral domain, but even in the epistemic or mathematical domain, it can happen in many domains of cognition, then one can test these intuitions on a wide range of cases to see if which of the two is more consistent across scenarios. So in general, we have two approaches to, I believe, to try to differentiate our biases, our heuristics, from the fundamental first principles instilled in us. And these are the armchair philosophical approach and the universal scientific approach. So the armchair philosophical approach is what I was saying before. It consists in utilizing system 2 thinking. So this is the slow, consistent type of thinking. So try to carefully reflect on which intuitions we generate seem to be more self-evident, seem to be more fundamental. And to do this, one can think about, can pit intuitions against one another and can evaluate them on a wide variety of cases. Just let me give an example of how one may use system 2 thinking, slow thinking, to ponder if a certain intuition is a heuristic or a first principle. So a moral intuition most of us seem to have is that killing is wrong. So for example, I share this moral intuition. Killing, I think, is indeed wrong. But is this a heuristic or is this a first principle? So if we take this intuition and we think about it in a plethora of cases, we see that there are some cases where the moral intuition appears to fail, or there seems to be something wrong. So for example, the case in which somebody is trying to murder a bunch of people and I had a gun in my hand, should I stop him? Or let's say he's trying to murder me, or he's in the process of doing something that seems horrible. Now in this case, killing, at least to me, doesn't seem that wrong. So this moral intuition is more likely to be a heuristic, at least in my account, than a fundamental principle, in the sense that it's something that serves us very well in the great majority of familiar scenarios, through my life. If I hold this principle dear, probably nothing is going to go wrong, because it's very rare that somebody's put in in a position where he has to save some people by killing another. In any case, though, it doesn't seem to be a universal principle in the sense that it works in every case. So this just seems to be an efficient heuristic that a moral cognition uses because it works pretty well. Okay, so this would be an example to how to distinguish a moral intuition from a fundamental principle. This is just a simple example. Yeah. So the scientific approach, and I'm seeing some typos in my writings, but I'm a statistician, so I don't know how to write. The scientific approach consists in trying to survey cross-cultural populations, study, it's through cross-cultural studies and maybe even historical studies. Now, of course, this is more easily said than done, because it's hard to perform these studies, and especially it's going to be hard to try to generate in people through system 2 thinking, so through slow thinking, what could be the ultimate goals that guide them in the moral sphere. So it's not that easy, but yeah. So we are going to propose that our first principles, what we necessarily value, so the objectives of our heuristics, basically given by the normative theory called utilitarianism. That seems quite a big leap. So let's just think about some things we might necessarily value. So I think that one thing we might all share in the moral domain is something of the sort that my unnecessary suffering is bad. A principle of this kind seems quite plausible. Then I think that because we are social creatures, we are social animals, we might also share a first principle that says something of a kind that the unnecessary suffering of innocent people is bad. We instinctively don't like the necessary suffering of other people, if they're innocent, and yeah. And this, I think, or something of a sort, could easily be construed as something that arises because we are social animals. So a principle of this kind makes sense. Now, Sidgwick, in the methods of ethics, through the armchair approach, has proposed some things, if according to our interpretation of what is going on in our cognition, some things that we necessarily value. So, for example, he says, whatever action any of us judges to be right for himself, he implicitly judges to be right for all similar persons in similar circumstances. This could be something that we all deep down think is true. Then he proposes another principle. The mere difference of priority and posteriority in time is not a reasonable ground for having more regard to the consciousness of one moment than that of another. So Sidgwick at the end basically concluded that these principles would spell out a utilitarian normative theory. In any case, we're going to proceed by thinking, okay, so if our first principles, if what we necessarily value, if these first principles coherently put together, and I believe it might be important that these first principles are coherent with one another, so you don't really, they would come out coherent. If these principles, you put them together, then you get basically a utilitarian theory. Now, once we propose this, we have to see, okay, does this make sense? Can we test this hypothesis that, by the way, we're making on the physical world, on the natural world? Can we test this hypothesis against the evidence? So we haven't been studying these things for that much time, so we don't have a lot of evidence to pit our model of morality against. But we can try. We can try to do our best and see what happens. So how well does our model fit the data? So if we assume that we have this dual process of cognition in the moral domain, and the first principles basically spell out utilitarianism, and then we have some biases on top of the first principles. We have heuristics to reach the first principles. Now, how does this model fit the data? So we're going to want to not only explain the evolution, the history of folk morality, so what we descriptively think about morality and how the ethical sphere has evolved through time, but we also want to explain the evolution of moral philosophy, because moral philosophy is produced by the moral domain of cognition. So moral philosophy doesn't just drop out of the sky, it is produced by humans through the moral domain of cognition. So we should be able, through our model, to explain both these areas. We should be able to say something on both these areas. Now, we don't have, very good data about this stuff, but fuck it, we're just gonna proceed anyway and just see what happens. So I'm gonna try to keep this short. I'm doing a bad job at keeping this short, because anyway, if somebody is more interested, he can look at the writings. In any case, so what is happening in the descriptive morality? So what is happening in folk morality is that people are internalizing norms of their culture through because they need heuristics to orient themselves in life, to decide what they ought to do and what is appropriate to do, what is ethically appropriate to do. This is actually very important because utilitarianism doesn't provide heuristics, rules with which to go about your life. A famous objection to utilitarianism is that utilitarians would always have to, stay still, calculating what is the best action they could take that would bring about the best outcomes. And this famous objection has some merit to it, so much so that utilitarians themselves have proposed that utilitarians shouldn't actually calculate every action, what outcome, what is the action that is going to maximize future happiness, because there's an infinite plethora of actions we can take, and so we seem to be undergoing an impossible challenge. So utilitarians themselves, they all say, okay, so we need a set of heuristics to orient ourselves. We need some simple rules of behavior that, on average, are going to increase happiness, because we are not godlike beings. We're just humans, and so we don't have infinite cognitive resources, so we can just use some heuristics. Now, notice how this already makes sense with how we have construed the moral domain working like other domains of our cognition with slow and fast processes. So if our first principles were indeed utilitarian, then the heuristics naturally follow logically that we would need some heuristics to follow these first principles, because we have finite cognitive resources. So what I believe happens in folk morality under this model of morality is that people internalize heuristics. So there are some people that the literature calls norm entrepreneurs that propose through system 2 thinking, usually, some norms for society. And the rest of society, I mean me included, we internalize these norms as heuristics. And this is necessary for us because we need heuristics to increase overall happiness. Okay, so how is folk morality? How does folk morality emerge? So basically, people through system 1 thinking have many intuitions that are connected to the heuristics and not the first principles that guide morality. So folk morality, many of the intuitions of folk morality are tied to the norm of a certain culture, because these heuristics are internalized. So it is not surprising that we see a variation between cultures concerning their moral intuitions. This is because different cultures have different environments, and they have their norms have followed a different stochastic trajectory. So it's not surprising that people in different cultures would have different moral intuitions, because the moral intuitions are not only tied to the first principles, but they're often tied to the heuristics one uses to follow the first principles. So our model of morality seems to be able to account for the fact that we see sometimes very different moral intuitions if we go in different societies. Once norms are adopted and internalized, they become heuristics that people in society naturally follow. So folk morality is born because the heuristics are confused with morality itself. Okay, so I'm not going to speak much more about this. It's gonna be too long. So what about explaining the evolution of moral philosophy? Okay, so this works in a similar manner as before. No, we're not gonna do a great deal of explaining, just to be honest, but we can sort of see what might be happening in the history of moral philosophy. And this is something similar as before, and the fact is that the classical theories of deontology and virtue ethics can be seen as confusing the biases, the heuristics, for fundamental principles, and then post hoc justifying them, trying to justify them post hoc. Now, not all theories, deontological theories and virtue ethic theories, work by spelling out some virtues or some rules to follow. This is true. I'm just trying to say how moral philosophy could have evolved under our account. And, it kind of makes sense that, for example, if we take a deontological moral theory such as the one proposed by the Bible, the Ten Commandments, it seems like deontology and virtue ethics have always been more practically useful than utilitarianism in a way, because they have historically, not always, but historically provided some principles one can follow, some rules that one can follow to live a good life, to live a moral life. So it's understandable why some may want to construe morality through a deontological or virtue ethics approach, because in a way it's more pleasing and it can be more useful to a person reading the philosophy. Yeah, and so these sections are actually not complete because I actually have a job. I actually have a job and I don't have time to write 22-page documents on metaethics. But that's what I spend my free time doing. These sections are a bit boring. I think there's actually some more formal type of evidence, some formal papers that connect harm to morality in a fundamental way, that see harm as a bedrock, as the bedrock foundation of morality. There's some studies they're mostly performed by Gray in the added completion literature. Okay, who cares about this stuff? I just wanted to think about some objections. There's two of the objections I'm going to consider. I'm just going to speak about these two. It seems like humans tend to care more for people in their in-group than people in their out-group. And this is not very utilitarian. Actually, it's not utilitarian. It's not utilitarian at all. So how can our account of moral cognition be true? Very good question. That's a very good question. We're going to resort to our usual tactic by saying that the in-group preference is a heuristic. It's a bias. Now, I haven't made the distinction between bad biases and good biases in this video, but we have some biases that I just call bad biases during this document, and the bad biases are like the egocentrical type of biases. So the biases connected to motivated reasoning, to thinking of oneself, to overrating one's own abilities, etc. And if one takes into account that a bias of this kind could exist even in the moral domain, we know it exists in the epistemic and logical domain. If a bias of this kind could exist even in the moral domain, well, then this could account a bit for the fact that we care more for people that are close to us. Of course, those people influence our happiness more, so we are going to care more for them because we have a kind of egocentrical bias going on. Maybe an explanation that I prefer is the fact that we can see caring for people close to us as a heuristic in the good sense, as a good bias. So as a heuristic that made sense, at least for most of our evolutionary history. So where is the happiness that we can increase? Well, it's close to us. It's the people that are close to us. It's the communities, our communities. It seems reasonable that if we want to orient ourselves to do good in the world, we would start with people close to us. Now, of course, in the 21st century, it's much easier to do good to people that are far away. But the heuristics we have developed to, maximize overall happiness couldn't predict the fast technological evolution we were going to undergo. So I think a way to perhaps see that, perhaps that caring more for one's in-group is a heuristic is to consider a human that is starving or that is without any resources. Well, that human, I believe that all of us, me included, of course, would care only about himself in that situation. Instead, when a human has more resources, both physical and cognitive resources, it seems like he expands his circle of care. And by the way, this fact of expanding our circle of care is something that seems to be true historically too. So if we look at the history of human evolution, it seems like we do care more about other beings the more we go along. So even sentient beings that are non-human. So by the way, yes, so I believe that the utilitarian theory that is spelled out by our first principles is one that wants to minimize suffering or maximize happiness. Okay, so let's not care about these details for the moment, but it wants to do so even for all sentient beings. So I believe we extend these moral principles do extend to animals or alien civilizations. Because indeed, historically, it seems to be a trajectory that we're going towards. And why does it make sense? Well, we have more resources. We have more cognitive resources too, because we get more educated. We have more time to engage in System 2 thinking. And because our environment has improved drastically. And it seems like we're starting to care more and more about animals, about people in other countries, as we would do, 4,000, 5,000 years ago. So what this seems to say to me is that our first principles would be, if we were in the case where we had infinite cognitive resources and infinite physical resources, we would just, across the board, increase the happiness of everybody. But because we are limited, we have to employ some heuristics. And these heuristics lead us to care more for the people close to us, etc., etc. And they are built through our evolutionary history. Now, of course, via voice, it's not so easy to summarize, but perhaps for some this might be a sensible answer. Okay, so then there's just another objection I wanted to talk about, and that is the naturalistic fallacy. Isn't saying that what humans necessarily value as good is good committing the naturalistic fallacy? So, if one accepts our definition of good, what the question amounts to say is good what humans necessarily value as good? And this requires a kind of tautological. We have defined good in such a way, so yes. But of course, the naturalistic fallacy, this is not really the question that the naturalistic fallacy is asking. The naturalistic fallacy is asking a kind of question where there is this ulterior good. There is this goodness that in some sense transcends us. So to ask the question, you have to kind of assume that there is this other definition of good that in some sense transcends us. Now, so the answer for me would be that this other notion of goodness doesn't exist. It doesn't make sense. So we are humans, we are biological organisms, we are governed by physical processes. Some of these physical processes concern what we believe we ought to do, what concern the moral sphere, and we necessarily value some things in the moral sphere. Now, we can't escape necessarily valuing some things in the moral sphere. We can't, there's no other ulterior good to appeal to. Yeah, I don't know if I can put it any better than this. Okay, so I think this is going to be all. Just to make it clear, I'm not 100% confident in my writings. Actually, I'm pretty sure that this is all going to be incorrect. Nonetheless, I hope that some people might take away something from this. And of course, critiques are welcome. Death threats are welcome. Also welcome is if somebody wants to say, oh, I think you did a good job doing this, or I think you did a good job doing that, or I like your channel. That's also welcome. Thank you. Oh yeah, I just wanted to stress too that all of this is it's a summary of my position. It's rough. So even these objections, I'm just writing some guidelines, but really some mnemonics for me. It's really some mnemonics. It's not. Don't take it as my best account of the matters. Just take it as a kind of summary, a rough summary. Yeah, I'm also going to put a link to the article below on my Substack.